Hey folks, so we'll talk about smart contracts and why they are neither smart nor contracts, and what the huge language barriers are between computer language and natural language, and why that hinders us from many things that smart contracts could do. So here are the things that we'll chat about. So first I'll introduce myself, obviously, then I'll do my favorite thing, which is hype bashing, and then we'll talk a little bit about the basics of smart contracts. And finally, we'll talk about the most important thing, language, and why contextual and implicit terms prevent us from doing many things with smart contracts. We'll look at a case study from contract law to understand why chickens are really, really hard to understand. And then we'll talk a little bit about final verdict and some payoffs. So I guess this is the obligatory part where I introduce myself. So, well, I'm Conrad and I study philosophy. I specialize in jurisprudence and contract theory, and I also have a little bit of a startup background. Yeah, that's about me. So let's do my favorite morning activity, which is hype train bashing. So here's what a naive crypto anarchist could say. By the way, really good illustration on the left. Smart contracts would remove bureaucracy is one of the things that you could hear. All of these quotes, by the way, are taken from X Friedman, link below. And yeah, let's get those things straight because they put the intention at the places where it shouldn't be. So let's fix it. So in order to do that, we first have to understand what smart contracts are. So let's cover the basics. So the most important thing is that smart contracts perform legal contracts. So let's take the simplest of examples. A simple contract. If I give you €1, you will give me one Coke, right? Very simple contract. It's so simple we don't even think about those things as contracts, but in fact it is a type of contract. It's a buy-sell contract. And let's look at how that would be performed traditionally and how that would be performed by a vending machine. So traditionally, that would be performed by the shopkeeper. So the contract has to be executed, performed by the shopkeeper, whereas a smart contract would self-execute or perform it itself, which would be the vending machine example. So the vending machine does everything automatically, no human touch involved. I think that's the most important thing to understand about smart contracts. But hey, I promised to talk about the language problem, right? So the very basics of the language problem is that computers use computer language and humans use human language. So human language is also referred to as natural language, computer language, programmatic language, or whatever. But the important thing is that human language is highly contextual, based on culture, based on common usage, and has a lot of implicit meanings. Whereas computer language has to be very explicit, very precise, and has no knowledge of culture and human experiences. So let's look at our vending machine example and look what the implicit terms are of that vending machine. So lots of implicit terms. For example, the can is filled with Coke, not fuel or whatever. So these are things that we understand because we as humans understand what a vending machine does. And we see the Coke, we see the coin, we kind of can put it together because we've seen so many vending machines. A computer can't, right? A computer doesn't have knowledge of the outside world, so everything has to be formulated very explicitly. So let's go deeper. So, for example, a vending machine has no concept of a euro coin, so you have to explain the €1 coin by defining, coin arithmetic. 100 euro cents are €1. These are the coins, and so on. Another thing is, it doesn't actually even understand the concept of coin, right? So you have to build a scale that would detect coins that weigh, 7.5 grams or whatever a coin weighs, and then these coins would be accepted as a €1 coin, and you have to do that for all the different coins. But going even deeper, there are so many implicit terms that we don't even think about when we say, if you give me €1, I will give you one Coke. For example, well, what happens if there's no Coke? What happens to the coin? What happens if you insert more? What happens when you insert less? So unfortunately, it gets even worse because it's not just a matter of writing really long lists with adding more and more detail. It turns out that those kind of definitions might not be possible at all. So there was this really clever lad called Wittgenstein, and he tried to define the word game. Now, we all have a very good intuitive understanding of what a game is. So, for example, solitaire is a game, football is a game, playing tag is a game, but traffic is not a game. Anyway, he tried to find commonalities between all those games to create one robust definition, but he could always come up with counterexamples. So things that would fit the definition but were actually not games. So, for example, for competitive multiplayer goal-driven activity, the counterexample is traffic. Well, traffic's not a game, but it has a lot of similarities with games. It's rule-based, you have a clear goal, and so on. Anyway, my point is, it's really good food for thought. So next time you go on a walk, think about possible definitions for games. Really cool. But Wittgenstein actually proved that it wasn't possible to define it the way we traditionally think of definitions, such like a list of properties that a thing has to have in order to be that thing. And well, that kind of sucks, but it also shows, explains to us a lot about law, because law is all about trying to find meanings and then discuss meanings. So like, what does this clause mean? What does that term mean? What is the common usage, and so on, and trying to infer that. So lawyers at Wittgenstein would say it play like language games. So they play with language to prove whatever they're trying to prove. So meanings are not only implicit, but they're also highly contextual. So here's a maybe slightly crazy example, but imagine you just painted your tree in your backyard red. You just decided to paint all the leaves red. And you have two friends. One is a biologist who studies photosynthesis, and the other is a painter who paints landscapes. Now imagine they call you on a phone and ask you, hey, do you know about any red trees in your district? Well, to the biologist, you would clearly say, no, I don't. And you wouldn't be lying, right? And to the painter, you would say, yes, I do. I've got one in my backyard. And in both cases, you wouldn't be lying, although both answers contradict each other. So how can that be? Well, because of context. So you understand that the biologist is probably looking for studying, they want to study red leaves because of like some photosynthesis related stuff. So it's important that the red leaves are actual red leaves, not painted red leaves. But for the painter, they just care about the look. So a painted red tree is probably perfectly fine for their landscape painting that they're planning to do, right? So that shows us how contextual language is, and that makes things really, really, really hard if you want to write things up very, very explicitly. So, I mean, we talked about trees and games and whatnot, but let's look at a real use case that happened in actual contract law. So there are those two companies that sound like they were generated randomly by some like business mogul video game. But yeah, they thought about the word chicken. So here's the case. Essentially, they agreed to buy and sell US fresh frozen chicken, grade A, government inspected, eviscerated. Right? And the buyer, they thought that it meant a young chicken suitable for broiling, and the seller thought it was any kind of bird of that genus. So what that means, probably the seller sold them old chicken, and the buyer said, well, old chicken is not chicken, right? And then they fought over that. Arbitration didn't work, so they had to fight over it at court. And look at the long list the court had to go through in order to come up with a simple conclusion. Well, chicken is ambiguous, but let's look at the thing. So they had to look at dictionary definitions. I mean, obviously, probably a good starting point. Then they looked at the text of the contract. Maybe there was some more context to it. Then they looked again at context. So the negotiation history of the two parties. So maybe some emails that were exchanged or whatever. That was pain in the ass because it was done in two languages. But anyway, so that might have created more context. Then evidence of trade usage. So general context in the industry, again, contextual meaning, like how do other people use that term? Then some inspection standards, like referring to some kind of authority that maybe already made some decisions on that, or how does that authority use that term? And then they also looked at prevailing market prices, which is an interesting way of looking at it, because imagine young chicken are much, much cheaper, for example, then you could infer from the price in the contract which one was like kind of being referred to, which one they were talking about just by the price. But anyway, all of that didn't work, and you can only imagine the legal fees on that. And they concluded that the white chicken was ambiguous after all. So unfortunately, the sad conclusion for anyone who hoped that smart contracts would eliminate bureaucracy, for example, is that, well, smart contracts do not eliminate ambiguity or bureaucracy. They actually hide it. So there's a really, really good quote, I think, and we'll have a look at how it acts, how smart contracts actually just add another layer of complexity on top of a system that's anyway really, really complex, right? So too long did not read. Humans speak human language, which is based on context and a lot of implicit meanings, and that's how we can phrase very, very simple, short sentences, and that actually convey a lot of context and carry a lot of implicit meanings. So smart contracts, unfortunately, only add another layer of complexity to something that's anyway incredibly complex and contextual and fuzzy and implicit and so on. So that additional layer looks as follows. Normally, the workflow would be first you negotiate in natural language, then you have to hire legal engineers to translate those terms into a smart contract. And then finally, you have to compare the outcomes of the smart contract with whether they correspond to what you actually agreed upon in the negotiation phase. So it just adds another layer of abstraction, and that means we need, well, legal engineers. So we need Web3 engineers who are able to actually write up the logic into programs and then simulate program outcomes. We need Web3 lawyers, which means they can negotiate terms in natural language, but also formulate logic in a way that's relevant to smart contracts, and then compare those meanings to program outcomes. And then finally, we need Web3 courts, which understand all of the previous stuff, right? In case arbitration has to occur, and inevitably, arbitration will have to occur because, well, that's just the nature of contracts. So the question becomes, when is it worth it? And I would say, I mean, this isn't a full list or anything, but I would say it's generally worth it if you have simple mass contracts where the fact that you have thousands or hundreds of thousands of users will offset the upfront cost of actually engineering the contract. Or you have extremely high security contracts where there's zero trust, for example, anonymous parties, because then you can't rely on traditional courts. It's also worthwhile to use smart contracts in like anywhere where they're broken institutions. So, for example, where the legal system doesn't work, or there's like high corruption or very, very high legal fees. Or another option is when you need stuff to be performed immediately. So speed is really, really important. But smart contracts are probably not that great or are just overkill when there is a lot of expertise required. So you have to get like really nitty-gritty with meanings of words, and maybe there are many such terms that are kind of fuzzy. Any kind of low value contract that's low, like that's non-mass, like that doesn't get repeated hundreds of thousands of times. And in any legal system where courts actually work quite well and perhaps are cheap. So that's actually the case in probably most of Western Europe, probably the US and so on. Courts work relatively well. Of course, there are many things that are really, really broken with them, and legal fees are often very, very high. But overall, the frameworks are relatively good and solid. So in those cases, probably not worth using smart contracts. Anyway, big thank you for lasting this long. And if you found this interesting, please let me know. It will help me make more content. But also, please do chat me up anytime if you're just curious about smart contracts, if you just want to chat about smart contracts, or anything else for that matter. It really helps me procrastinate, and I'm a pro procrastinator. So please do help me. You can reach me on Telegram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and so on. So hopefully see you. Bye. Thanks.